Welcome to today's presentation on ICF's report on the cost effectiveness of the residential provisions of the 2021 IECC. Next slide. My name is Amy Boyce. I am the director of the Energy Efficient Codes Coalition, and I will be moderating today's session in Q&A. Please enter all questions through the Q&A button, and we will provide about 15 to 20 minutes at the end of the session to go through all of those questions that have been submitted. This session will also be recorded for those who would wish to view it later. Michael Brown will be leading the presentation today. Michael is a senior project manager for ICF, where he supports energy efficiency policy development and implementation for federal, state, local, and utility clients. He has supported the US EPA's Energy Star Certified Homes program since 2012. Michael has also previously worked to help the US Department of Energy develop energy conservation standards and test procedures for appliances and equipment. Thank you, Michael, for being here with us today. And please go ahead and start your presentation. Looks like we had some trouble with our intro slides, but hopefully the presentation will go through.
All right. Thanks for that introduction, Amy. Yeah, so as you said, I'm Michael Brown with ICF. I'm going to be talking through the cost effectiveness of the residential provisions of the 2021 IECC. So let's dive right into it. For my agenda, I'm going to give a little bit of background for this study and the IECC in general, and talk about the methodology we took to put this report out. And then briefly, I'm going to go over some high-level changes to the 2021 code. I'm not going to be getting into that much detail into them, but I want to orient everyone to what's changed. Then we'll be talking about what kind of savings result from those code changes and the associated costs of those code changes. So I'm going to give an overview to set the context for kind of what type of cost we're talking about, and then go into a few specifics for some incremental costs. And then with the savings and costs kind of covered, then we can talk about cost effectiveness and how we went about calculating that, and then end with some conclusions or takeaways. And we should have some time at the end for a Q&A session. So keep those questions coming in and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. All right, so background and methodology. The International Code Council, or the ICC, updates their model building codes on a 3-year cycle, and the 2021 IECC, or the International Energy Conservation Code, was the latest one, and that was published in January of 2021. In June of that year, DOE and PNNL put out a determination that the 2021 IECC is cost effective. And in the same month, the National Association of Homebuilders had a report done by Home Innovation Research Labs to look at the code, and it showed that the 2021 IECC is not as cost effective as DOE reported. In this presentation, I abbreviate it in the slide deck HIRL, but I'm just going to be saying home innovation. Then in January of this year, ICF reviewed the home innovation report and updated aspects of it and came up with a similar conclusion to DOE and PNNL, namely that the code looks like it's cost effective. So kind of what gives? Why are there different conclusions for the same code on paper? That's what I'll be getting into a little bit more detail here. So how did we answer this question? Why are there different conclusions? Generally, our methodology was to, quote, check the math of the home innovation report. To do that, we used energy savings directly from that report. So we're starting with the same savings estimates. What we primarily focused on was reevaluating the costs of the code changes. So we would determine if a code change resulted in an incremental cost in practice. Then we'd compare the cost in the home innovation report to other publicly available sources and update if necessary. And then once we had updated cost, we would determine cost effectiveness through a life cycle cost, or LCC, and a simple payback. Essentially, the purpose was to evaluate the home innovation report in order to have kind of an apples to apples comparison. And I do want to note that if I had started from scratch, I probably would have used a methodology that was closer to PNNLs. So let's talk about why that is. What are the kind of notable differences between the two methodologies that these two organizations took? So a quick summary of that: home innovation looked at 6 locations across the country versus PNNL looked at 18. Home innovation looked at 1 to 3 foundation types, depending on which climate zone you're looking at, versus PNNL looked at 4 foundation types in every location. Just 1 fuel type for home innovation versus PNNL's 4. Home innovation actually looked at 2 wall types, a mass wall and a wood frame wall in some climate zones. PNNL only considered wood frame walls. So this comes down to a total of 20 unique permutations or home types for home innovation against 256 for PNNL. So that's quite a difference in terms of the amount of kind of modeling and the different, results you could see between those different permutations. But there are some similarities. They both looked at single family homes, 3-bedroom homes. Home innovation was 2,500 square feet. PNNL was 2,376. So those are fairly close, but it's a minor difference. We're really focused on results for single family homes today. But home innovation didn't look at multifamily, but PNNL does have results for low-rise multifamily buildings as well. So I think to summarize, PNNL looked at more locations, foundation types, fuel types, so as a result had a larger total number of permutations, and they looked at multifamily buildings as well. So I'd kind of consider the PNNL study to be a little bit more robust and thorough. That's why I said if I had started from scratch, I would have used a methodology closer to that. All right, with that background, let's go to some of the changes that have happened in the 2021 code. There were several significant envelope improvements made in the 2021 IECC. I've summarized them here in this table with redline the changes. So just to go through them briefly, in climate zone 3 and 4, there's an improvement to the window U factor. In climate zone 5, there's a slight improvement to the solar heat gain, which was basically being met in practice already. In climate zones 2 through 8, everywhere except climate zone 1, there was an increase in the ceiling R value. In climate zone 4 and 5, there are improved wall assemblies, basically through adding continuous wall insulation. And then slab insulation was either increased or added in climate zones 3, 4, and 5. So we have a lot of envelope improvements here. And then just a few points on systems and lighting. 100% high efficacy lighting and lighting controls are now required. Mechanical ventilation fan efficacy was updated to Energy Star version 4 levels. Mechanical ventilation testing is now required. And finally, an ERV or an HRV, some type of balanced ventilation system with heat recovery, is required in climate zones 7 and 8. Okay, last slide on the summary of the changes is one of the kind of bigger changes in the 2021 code. In the prescriptive path, it requires that 1 of 5 additional efficiency package options be selected. So I'm going to go through each one of those 5 that a builder could choose one of them to use. So the first one is the enhanced envelope performance option, which basically means a 5% improvement in the building thermal envelope. The next one is a more efficient HVAC equipment performance. So that would be basically a 95 AFUE furnace and a 16 SEER air conditioner, or a 10 HSPF 16 SEER heat pump. The next one is the service water heating option. So this is an 82 EF gas water heater. So basically a tankless water heater, or a 2.0 EF electric water heater, which is basically requires a heat pump water heater. The fourth one is we have the more efficient duct thermal distribution system. Basically, that means 100% of the ductwork is in conditioned space. And then the last one of these 5 options is we have the improved air sealing and efficient ventilation option, meaning you must hit 3 ACH 50 for infiltration and include a ERV or an HRV. All right, so as I said, that was going to be a really brief overview of what's changed. That's not the focus of this presentation, but with those changes, what kind of savings do you realize? Generally, PNNL and Home Innovation had pretty similar results in savings, roughly 9% energy cost savings on the national average. And looking at each location or climate zone, there's somewhere between 4 and 10% savings in each climate zone. There are some kind of notable discrepancies between the two. In climate zone 3 and 7, we weren't really able to determine what caused this, but as I noted before, there are differences in the methodologies. So it could be, some different assumption in the architecture, locations, foundation types, HVAC systems, or some other modeling assumption. But there are those differences, but we weren't able to figure out why they're there. But at a high level, at a national level, there's, pretty general agreement between the two reports. So in addition to energy cost savings, there are other non-economic benefits that are generally not accounted for in calculations of cost effectiveness. I thought those would be relevant to mention because they could be factored into a state or a jurisdiction's decision to adopt a more efficient code. So I just wanted to highlight some of those things that people might consider. One is emission reductions. So that's a little over 8% according to PNNL. Another could be enhanced occupant comfort. For example, if you're adding continuous wall insulation or slab insulation, it's reducing thermal bridging and cold spots on a wall or on the floor near a wall. It can also help with grid reliability because there are associated reductions in peak demand for more efficient homes. It could also increase resilience because a better insulated and a tighter home can hold and maintain their temperature longer during a power outage or an extreme weather event. And there could also be cost savings from purchasing smaller HVAC equipment because you might have reduced heating and cooling loads, so you need to buy a smaller air conditioner, for example. That type of cost was not included in any of the cost effectiveness we're looking at, but that could occur. And then finally here, there's limited opportunity for future envelope improvements in homes that are being built right now. It's never more cost effective than at the time of construction to make a building efficient. So these are all things that could be factored into whether or not to adopt a new code besides just purely the economic costs and savings. None of these are factored in, but I thought it might be important to note that. All right, so we have savings down. Let's move on to costs. And I want to put those costs in context so we can focus our conversation to the kind of small part of the cost of building a home we're talking about. In 2019, NAHB conducted a survey and found that on average, the sale price of a new construction home was about $187 per square foot. Of that, the construction cost was about 60% of that cost, and it was $114 per square foot. The remaining costs were about, roughly 73 per square foot, but they're not things to do with the actual house itself and that square footage. And those were land, financing, overhead, marketing, a sales commission, and profit. And today we're talking about the incremental cost for the 2021 IECC. It's somewhere between, $1 and $2.50 a square foot, depending on whose study you're looking at. And if you take that and you look at the total cost, it's significant. It's between $2,300, $6,500 on average, depending on whose estimate you're looking at. Or it's about, an increase of about 0.5% to 1.45% of the sales price. But it would result in a mortgage increase somewhere between $8 and $24 a month. And I wanted to point that out because the total cost, just looking at it, might seem really significant, but few people are paying that upfront. Typically it's financed and it's spread out over time, included in a monthly mortgage payment. So that's the portion we're focused on today. But to continue to put costs in context, probably everyone's aware that home prices and construction materials have significantly increased in cost recently. Housing affordability is a major issue that affects a lot of people, but increased efficiency plays a minor role in the total home prices we're seeing today. And unlike other costs to build a house, energy efficiency and more efficient codes do provide a regular economic return to the homeowner through reduced energy bills. So they can be a cost-effective investment to make. And that's really what we're trying to determine when we look at cost effectiveness. Is it reasonable or worth it to ask homeowners to pay more for a new home in return for energy savings? So that's kind of what we're focused on here. And with that background, let's get into some of the costs that are specific to code changes in the 2021 IECC. So starting with the national average cost, the home innovation estimate was about twice as high as PNNL's estimate. So we had about 6,500 versus 2,300. And after we went through our review of the home innovation report, we ended up with costs that were closer to PNNL's estimate. So our revised number was 2,700 on average, so slightly higher than PNNL's estimate. So from that last slide, we saw that home innovations costs were much higher than PNNL's. What we did next was compare energy savings on the x-axis to cost per square foot, incremental cost per square foot on the y-axis from several studies from PNNL looking at code changes over time. So the 2009, the 2012, 2018 IECC, and estimates from EPA's Energy Star program, looking at their incremental costs. We kind of saw a general trend: the more you save, the more you spend, which makes sense. And everything tended to have an incremental cost somewhere between 50 cents and $1.50 per square foot. And then we get to PNNL's estimate of the 2021 IECC. Costs become a little bit higher than the other points here. And if you think about it, this makes sense because there are diminishing returns in efficiency. As a building gets more and more efficient, it's harder to save the same percent of energy. And so it gets a little bit more expensive. And I think that's what we're starting to observe here with the 2021 code. And then we can put home innovations estimates on the same graph. And again, you can see they're kind of an outlier. They're a lot higher than PNNL's estimates. And then we can put ICF's revised costs on the same chart. And we see that they come down to be closer in line with what PNNL had and kind of more in line with the other studies we had out there. So the whole point of this chart is just to illustrate again how when we looked at the home innovation costs, they seemed to be high. They didn't line up with other analysis and studies we had considered. So we wanted to dig into them deeper. So before I get into the details of how we updated some of these costs, I want to say that we should probably consider these costs illustrative. In practice, costs vary based on the current construction practices, local market conditions, the architecture of the homes, vendor relationships. For example, a builder might have the purchasing power to get materials at a lower price than that's available to the average consumer. And I'd also say consider these costs probably conservative because everything in this analysis assumes prescriptive path code compliance. So there's really limited flexibility to how you meet that. There are other means to be code compliant, like the performance path or the ERI path and UA trade-offs for the building thermal envelope. Using any of these, builders might be able to find more cost-effective ways to achieve the same level of performance and still be code compliant. So I think that's an important point. This looks at code from a very rigid perspective, but in practice, there is some flexibility on how you meet it. So here's what we did when we looked at the home innovation report. I'm going to go into more detail on the next couple slides. So first, we did update the profit margins that were used. Some code changes were revised to be $0 in incremental costs. Material costs were updated to publicly available sources, and labor costs generally were unchanged. All right, starting with profit margins. In the home innovation report, every code change had a builder's gross profit margin applied on top of it. So for example, if the materials required by a code change costed an extra $100, the cost to the homeowner is actually higher than that $100 because it accounts for the builder's overhead and profit. The home innovation report reported they used a gross profit margin of 19% for all costs. And this was based on a 2019 value, which we saw was the highest builder profit since 2006. When reviewing, we saw that a lot of code changes appeared to have a profit margin of 24% applied on top of that, which was, again, higher than profits we'd observed. For our analysis, we retained the approach of applying a profit margin to reflect the cost a homeowner would actually incur. But instead, we revised it to 17.5% based on an average profit margin over time, looking at a couple different resources. So this did reduce the cost for kind of every code change that was evaluated. So it was kind of a global change. As I mentioned, some code changes were revised to be $0 in incremental cost. There were 6 of these in total. Previously, they were a total of $2,376 in the home innovation report, but I will say those didn't necessarily apply to every single home, but that was the total of those individually. So this was done because these code changes were determined to be administrative with really negligible incremental effort, already met in practice based on existing code requirements or market conditions, or they were clarifications to existing requirements and not new requirements in the code. So on this slide, I put in a bunch of charts comparing the costs for some of the most expensive code changes. Home innovations estimates are in red, PNNLs are in yellow, and ICFs are in blue. Generally, the costs that ICF developed were closer to PNNLs, a little bit higher in most cases, but both of which are substantially lower than the home innovation estimate. At this point, I do want to point out that the structure of ICF's report mirrors the home innovation one. So in both of those, you could go to Appendix A and compare the detailed assumptions there to see how they differ. And let me do one comparison as an example here to get into the details of how some of these things changed. And that's for the heat pump water heater that was used for the additional efficiency option. So PNNL estimated a baseline storage water heater that would have been used without this code requirement was $400. And then they estimated that the heat pump water heater was $1,375. So that resulted in an incremental cost of $975. So that was PNNL's starting point. So then we compare it to Home Innovation's estimates. They had a baseline water heater cost $419. The heat pump water heater was almost $1,200. Mixing valve was $175, and labor to install that valve was $17. So this resulted in an incremental cost of $972, including an incremental overhead and profit of almost $360. This led to a total incremental cost of just over $1,300 for this code change. So when we evaluated this, we updated material prices from products that were identified from major retailers and distributors in November of last year, 2021. So it's possible prices have changed since a couple months ago. But at that point, we found a baseline water heater was available for about $500. A heat pump water heater was available for $1,359, and a mixing valve was available for $52. And we did keep the same labor for installing the valve at $17. So this results in a slight decrease in material costs of $43, a little over $100 reduction in overhead, which totaled up to a total reduction of $153 for this code change compared to the Home Innovation estimate. So this type of approach was used for each code change that had a cost. We went through each part of it and evaluated the cost of each individual item and updated it. So with that updated cost information, we moved on to calculating cost effectiveness. I have a quote here from DOE to describe what cost effectiveness is. And they say it determines whether code changes are economically justified from the perspective of a public policy that balances costs against energy savings over time. So that's what we're trying to do here. Home Innovation did this using simple payback, which is, by definition, a kind of simplistic metric, and it only includes costs and benefits directly related to measures. It's essentially the first cost divided by the annual savings, and it shows the number of years until that investment is recouped. So we instead focused on looking at the life cycle cost, or LCC, which is a more robust cost benefit metric that is a complete accounting for costs and benefits over time. It's the primary metric that DOE and PNNL use to evaluate code changes. And in our report, the convention was that an LCC less than 0 was cost effective. So I could phrase this a couple different ways. That means it's a negative cost or savings to the homeowner, or we could also say that benefits exceeded costs, but negative is good, it's cost effective. And LCC is basically calculated as the present value of costs minus benefits over a 30-year period. So costs that are accounted for include the down payment on the home, the mortgage fee, the property tax, the mortgage payments, and replacement costs. So for example, that water heater I mentioned on the last slide, that's not going to last the full 30 years of the analysis period. So it's going to be replaced in that time period. So that cost is accounted for. And benefits include energy savings, tax deductions, and a residual value of measures. So for that residual value in the water heater example, if that was replaced in year 29 of the analysis and there's only 1 year left, that water heater still has a really good life left on it, still has a value, still has future benefit. So that residual value is considered a benefit and included in an LCC calculation. All right, so first let's look at everyone's simple payback results. The Home Innovation Report had an average payback of 32 years. It ranged from 20 to 79 years in each climate zone. And using that same metric, PNNL and ICF had an average payback somewhere between 10 to 12 years on average nationally. And in each climate zone, it ranged from 2 to somewhere up to 28 years. And just to be clear, the main driver of this difference is the incremental costs. That's it, because we started with fairly similar savings. But as I mentioned before, simple payback was not our preferred metric. We think LCC is more appropriate when evaluating cost effectiveness. So PNNL and ICF estimated an average net benefit of $2,300 to $2,600 as a national average. And that was when using the water heater efficiency package option. Essentially, that means this is how much a homeowner eventually ends up saving over time. And I do want to point out that ICF's estimate in climate zone 7 is actually a net cost, meaning that wasn't cost effective. And there are some discrepancies between our results and PNNL's results in climate zone 3 and 7, which is a result of the discrepancy in savings in those locations that I mentioned before. So in addition to the water heater option, we have results for 4 of the 5 additional efficiency package options. With these, ICF basically is concluding that the 2021 IECC is cost effective in all climate zones, and there are multiple cost-effective compliance options in each. So in this chart, a negative LCC is in blue. That means it's cost-effective. So just to run through these quickly, we have the base 2021 IECC without any of the additional efficiency options that are required. That by itself was cost-effective everywhere except for climate zone 7. Then when we add on the HVAC option, that one is cost effective across the board, nationally and in each climate zone. The water heater option was cost effective nationally, except for in climate zone 7, which I mentioned before. And the ventilation option, it appeared to only be cost effective in climate zones 3 and 6, and just barely in those cases. And then finally, the duct option, where you're moving your ductwork into conditioned space, that appears to be cost effective for every location and foundation type that was analyzed. So coming to the end of the presentation here, and what are the main takeaways? So the first takeaway, kind of that everyone generally agrees with, is the 2021 IECC saves about 9% nationally on average. It varies somewhere between 4 to 10% in each climate zone. So we generally have agreement that there are savings resulting from this code. To achieve those savings, there is an incremental cost. ICF and PNNL estimate that on a national average, it's somewhere between $2,300 to $2,700. It's going to vary roughly between $1,200 and $4,000 in each climate zone, depending on where you're looking at and what efficiency package option you are assuming is used. And additionally, based on our review and comparing to other reports, the home innovation costs appeared to be higher than what we or PNNL would have estimated. A big takeaway is the 2021 IECC is cost effective for homeowners. We and PNNL estimate a net benefit somewhere between $2,300, $2,600 nationally, as I mentioned before. And the final big takeaway, the conclusion of all of this, I would say, is trying to answer the question of who to reference with all these conflicting reports. My suggestion is that PNNL's report has reasonable cost estimates, and they use a robust methodology. And so because of that, I think that PNNL and DOE's work should be leveraged and used when evaluating whether a state or a jurisdiction should adopt the 2021 IECC. So that's what I think this all boils down to, is who do we point to when we're deciding? And I think we should look at DOE and PNNL's work. So those are my big conclusions. And with that, we do have almost a little over, 20 minutes left for a Q&A session. And I do have my contact information up on this screen. So I'll leave that there for everyone.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate this presentation and going through this so thoroughly. We do have some questions that have come in, and I think they're still coming in. A reminder to everyone, just so we can keep this organized, please put your Q&A, your questions into the Q&A feature that is located at the bottom of your screen, and we'll go through them I'm trying to keep track of them and as they come in. So a few questions that we've started here, and some I believe are specific to certain portions of the presentation. So we might be a little bit difficult to go back in some of them. One question is, besides the PNNL 2021 IECC report, are there other studies then besides Home Innovations report that it didn't line up with?
I had dug around and I couldn't find anything else. No, the main ones were what I had on that one slide with the scatter chart, was to compare results. There's PNNL's estimate, there's Home Innovations estimate, there's our redo of Home Innovations report, and then we have various older historical studies looking at other code changes and above code programs to compare them to. So I'm not aware of anything else besides the one I've talked about, but maybe there will be some more coming out.
Thank you. Next question was, what were the 6 costs that were revised to 0?
I'd have to dig some of those up, but one of them, for example, was there was some additional information that is required to be on a certificate of code compliance. So for example, it would say what path you used, what if you had solar or PV on the house, what was the nominal capacity of that? Some other information that would be required to be on the report. And our information was, this was something that was already produced. In many cases, it can be produced automatically by software. You're using the model code compliance. So adding that is really either a one-time effort by whoever makes that software or that report, or it's information that's readily available to the builder and easy to put on a report. And it shouldn't really be in practice considered an incremental cost because it's such a small amount of effort to add one field to a report or a certificate. So there were things like that. There were also some others about insulation labels for R values on insulation, which in practice is basically already done and also essentially required by code already. So there were some like that we revised down. I can't remember the other ones off the top of my head, but as I mentioned, the report that we put out mirrors the Home Innovation report. So you could look at the two side by side, and in the appendix, there's a single page for each code change. So you could just look at those two and see which ones were revised down. And we included our justification for why we thought those weren't incremental costs in practice in that appendix.
Thank you, Michael. Sorry, as a reminder, if you are asking a question that you would like Michael to answer, please put it in the Q&A, not in the chat. I cannot monitor both. Let's see. What is the national average kilowatt hour cost assumption that was used?
The energy price would be, it was the average rate from EIA in 2019. I don't remember the exact value. It's somewhere around 12 to 13 cents a kilowatt hour. But it's in the report. I don't remember it off the top of my head, but it's the national average from 2019.
Thank you. And a reminder, the link to the report and the comparison document was put in the chat, and it was also part of the registration email. Next question. On the cost effectiveness results slide, why did the 2021 IECC with ventilation option fail to provide any cost savings in most climate zones? What type of ventilation was assumed?
You know, that was one of the questions I asked myself. It seemed a little counterintuitive to me as well. I would have expected more savings from it in some of the colder climates. I know those type of systems are frequently used in really cold climates because they can provide, you know, benefit. So that is something that we frankly didn't have access to. It was Home Innovation did their modeling in BOPT, and they gave some details on how they modeled that, but not to the degree that I could look into and know exactly how they set up their ventilation system. So I don't know the answer to that. But looking at it, I thought there would have been a little bit more savings, but I didn't have access to information to really evaluate that.
Thank you. What are the reasons for the differences in cost estimates between PNNL and ICF? Is it inflation, or are there other reasons?
There are multiple reasons. You could go to, I think big picture, I would look at it and say, high level, we're not that far off. And I also want to say that one slide where I said, consider these costs illustrative. They're going to be vary in practice. One of the reasons is that the house size in the PNNL report is different than the one in Home Innovation that we used. There's a couple 100 square foot difference in the size of the home. So just that by itself will result in different costs. If you have a different wall area or floor area, the amount of materials you need for insulation or whatever will be different. So that's one reason. And then second is our approach for this was to go to publicly available sources and pull costs for materials and equipment. And DOE did that for some of their estimates, or DOE and PNNL. Sometimes I say those interchangeably, but they did that for some of their estimates. And for others, they had other resources and databases and studies that they cited. So you could get a slightly different cost depending on which source you're looking at. Ours was generally to look at, you know, a retailer or distributor for a specific piece of equipment that you could go out and buy. And that did result in some differences between our estimates and theirs. But I would just reiterate, I'd consider these costs illustrative and high level. We're in the same range. We're fairly close to each other. So I wouldn't really point that out as any issue or anything.
Great, thank you. Were the analyses conducted by each group done using the same compliance pathway, i.e. performance, ERI, US alternative?
Yeah, so they all, that's something, maybe I'll dig into that a little bit more. They all assume the prescriptive path compliance in code. So that is, you must do these things to be code compliant. There's not much flexibility in that. And then we get to, in the 2021 IECC, there are the 5 additional efficiency package options you can choose from. PNNL only considered the water heater option. In their view, that was easier to analyze, one that was likely to be selected. So for their national level analysis, they focused on that one only, which is a completely valid way to meet the code requirement. Home Innovation also looked at the prescriptive path and then looked at 4 out of the 5 options you could pick. They did not look at the enhanced envelope one. They thought that probably wasn't going to be used, which I think might be likely. So that's one difference between the two, is that Home Innovation looked at more of those options than PNNL, but none of them looked at the prescriptive path, or sorry, none of them looked at the performance path or the ERI path. The reason for that is essentially that there is really a lot of different ways you could achieve code compliance in those paths. And because of that flexibility, it's nice in practice because a builder has a little bit of flexibility on how they're going to meet the code. But from an analytical perspective, it's very hard to determine what the cost of that would be when you have countless ways you could meet that code requirement. So it's very hard to put a price on it. That's why all of these generally just look at the prescriptive path.
Thank you. Along those lines, another question, shouldn't the results for without an additional EE option be viewed within the context that it does not represent a building being built to code? I'm not sure it makes sense to be comparing those to buildings built to code with an EE point option.
Yeah, I think it's we did have the one result in there for the base 2021 IECC option without one of the 5 required additional efficiency package options. That by itself, I agree, is not code compliant, and by itself is probably not necessarily what you would want to look at. The way it is informative is you can compare that to the 4 efficiency package options that were modeled. So you could see they're incremental from that one to see which one is saving more than the others, which one is more cost effective. So it's really a point of reference. That's how I think it could be used instead of just looking at it by itself.
Thank you. Next question. Is there any difference in cost resources, real life project cost surveys, RS means, or any other literature/cost database? Is the estimation, material takeoff, methodology the same, or regional specific costs considered? It's a lot of questions within one.
I'll take the last part first. In this, regional costs were not assessed. There are adjustment factors you can apply from various sources to try and adjust costs for local conditions where things like labor wages might change. So that was not addressed. A lot of times when you're looking at a code and looking at it at a national level, it can often get more complicated to try and customize it to each location. That's different if you're looking at the adoption in a specific location. You can definitely customize cost to local costs that are seen right there. And then for other sources, there are lots of cost sources out there. NREL has some good sources. RS Means is a subscription tool where you can get a lot of construction cost estimates out of it. There are material costs available from, just retailers and distributors' websites. There are lots of different ways you can estimate costs. I'm not sure if I really want to try and claim that one is better than the other. They are all estimates of cost that are out there. They have their pros and cons. So I think I'll just acknowledge that there are a lot of them out there, a lot of different resources on estimating construction costs, and they all try and establish those costs in a slightly different way. But yeah.
Next, your references to cost effectiveness are over the 30-year mortgage period you assume is the life cycle in your calculation. Sorry, I'm reading. Is that what you assumed is the life cycle in your calculation? If so, why did you assume a 30-year mortgage as the life cycle?
Yeah, good question. For that, DOE has a methodology that they have established for how to evaluate code changes, and we try to follow parts of that. And so part of that is that for PNNL's methodology follows that exactly. So it establishes locations to model, building configuration, permutations, weighting factors, all that stuff. The other thing it establishes is cost effectiveness metrics. So it describes how you should go about calculating a life cycle cost. So that's what we followed. And in that, it says you should look at a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, and you should use, X, Y, and Z values for the terms of that. And you should look at, the most recent rates from EIA to look at fuel prices. It's very prescriptive on all the inputs that go into the LCC. And so that's what we used when we did our LCC calculations. We followed that DOE methodology. That's been around for a while. It was developed through a public comment period process. The stakeholders got to provide input on it. So we, for other projects at ICF, use that for a lot of things because we think it's a really good, thorough, well thought out methodology. So that was the reason we've used that 30-year mortgage.
Thank you. There's a number of questions about the software. If you could just reiterate what software was used by Home Innovation, ICF, and PNNL.
Yeah, Home Innovation used BOPT in their modeling. It is an energy modeling tool developed by NREL. It uses Energy Plus on the back end. So that's what Home Innovation used. It's a very good tool. I use it for other things all the time. So we at ICF, we just used Home Innovation's energy savings results. So we used those results from their modeling. So indirectly, we used BOPT as well. And then PNNL used Energy Plus just directly for their modeling. So fundamentally, everyone's using Energy Plus. It's kind of the standard energy modeling tool, especially for residential buildings. PNNL used it directly. Home Innovation used BOPT, which uses that on the back end. So everyone's kind of using essentially the same tool there. But even within that, there are lots of different ways there are lots of different assumptions in those tools that could influence results. So everyone's using the same tool, but that doesn't mean everyone's results will be exactly the same.
Great, and I think we'll do one final question here. I believe this was covered, but just to clarify, what type of home are the final savings presented referring to? It's understood that is the national average in terms of how much energy is being saved, but they were unclear or missed what type of housing was being considered. Yeah,
it's a 3-bedroom single family detached home for everything. In PNNL's analysis, it is a slightly smaller 3-bedroom home than what Home Innovation modeled, and their architecture is slightly different, but the basic answer is a 3-bedroom single-family detached home.
Great. Thank you very much. I think that is all the time we have for questions right now. We will keep track of the chat and the questions, and you know, feel free to reach out. Michael has provided his information here, and I have provided my information with the registration. So you can reach out to Amy at energyefficientcodes.com .org, and also look at our website, energyefficientcodes.org, to find this report and the comparison report. We thank you very much. Michael, we thank you for taking the time to go through this report today. And thank you all for joining us and for a lively chat and a lively Q&A. We appreciate your being active and participatory in the presentation. So thank you very much, and have a great Friday afternoon.